Welcome to the channel. Today, we're exploring some unbelievable story. Stay tuned and let's dive in. Emily relaxed on the deck by the lake. The water felt cold on the fingers of the hand that was stretched over the edge. Clouds lingered above, gently moving over the high hills on each side of the lake. She was in another universe, away from the city's rat race and the continuous demands of whining actors and arrogant musicians who came to play on her stage. She was also distant from Daniel. She wasn't sure what to make of that discovery. She knew she loved Daniel, but he was such a workaholic. He could never find time to go away, and his schedule was quite strict. She didn't feel that their time together was important. This brief retreat with Chris was just what she needed. What might Daniel do to her? Divorce her? Ah well. She glanced across to Chris. He stood on the beach with his back to her, curling dumbbells in the sun as he finished his morning exercise. Muscles rippled up and down his back, and his large arms glistened with perspiration. Chris was a college football standout until he injured his knee. Chris now runs a local fitness facility chain and maintains his physique in this rippling lean condition. He had been prudent with his father's money and engaged a manager who put it in real estate. Who cared that he knew nothing about anything but money? He couldn't have a discussion about anything other than football and bodybuilding. But as he drew her into his hug, it was like something from a cheap book. She swooned as he raised and carried her to the bed. So he was a touch tiny in the area where most guys fit in. In contrast, he made up for it with his tongue and money. Okay, Daniel, she thought, divorce away. We have no children to damage, and look what I'll end up with. I'll get married to Mr. Universe. This makes me Mrs. Universe. I'll exchange a dusty theater for a gym where I can work out whenever I want or spend all day ogling bodybuilders in tights. She couldn't wait for his call, which may never arrive. She recalled how Daniel reacted when she told him she was going out to spend the following week with Chris, how she would be having sex with him all week, and how she would be better off with a wealthy young man than a loser like him. She had half expected a process server to find her here with divorce papers. She picked up her mobile phone for the 100th time today to ensure it was functional and ready for his call. The battery was charged, and there was a strong signal owing to the handy mobile phone tower she saw on the summit. The ringer was set at high volume, but Daniel did not answer it. They had not contacted her from work, as she had planned. This vacation week was arranged months ago, and Daniel hasn't called. You made your bed a week after submitting an online answer. I hope you sleep well in it. It was an obvious sign that he intended to abandon her. How can you threaten someone and then not contact them for a week? However, it was Thursday and Daniel had not responded. She sat upright on the dock. Her nude body gleamed after a week of tanning every day, seeing various vineyards and trying different restaurants each night. She adored the Blue Ridge Lakes. The sunset light casts a lovely shine over everything here. Why had Daniel always insisted on spending his holiday at the Cape Cottage? There are no people here, no teeny bopper beaches, just the serene isolation of the forests. Callan. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Why hasn't he called? It was quite bizarre. She sat up and dialed her home number. The messaging service responded. It was annoying to hear a tape of her own voice responding. She left a note in Daniel's box, saying she'd be home early Sunday and they could discuss then. When she hung up, she sat pensively, holding the phone. Perhaps there would be no divorce. Maybe Daniel was terrified and would turn over and ask her to come home, but he was too proud to call. Maybe he'd do better from now on, cook, clean, and treat her like a goddess. Oh certainly, Daniel, the cuckold, would cater to her every want while she rushed off to enjoy her stud Chris's wonderful physique. Of course, after Chris swept her off her feet and serviced her with his gifted tongue, she could always return home and have Daniel fill her aching but empty glory hole with that enormous gorgeous tool of his. She would make him plead. If Daniel was upset, he should have stayed at home. Why hasn't he called? And if he wasn't furious, how did he feel? She knew he didn't have any shows this weekend. He wasn't home. He hadn't phoned for a week. He hadn't even texted. This was quite bizarre. He was depriving her of the argument she had been mentally preparing since she left. She desired this battle. She wanted to witness his enthusiasm, and he wasn't even delivering on it. She phoned home again, this time using the code for her personal message box rather than the general family box. It was filled. There were frantic calls from neighbors, Daniel's mother, and, most frighteningly, several from a detective named Mark Williams. Daniel seemed to have suffered serious injuries. Apparently, his injuries drew police notice. Oh my, her thoughts raced before returning to the last time she saw Daniel. She recalled Daniel's sobs when she informed him he wasn't the only guy in her bed. She stared at him with disgust and urged him to man up and stop crying. Chris snickered softly in the doorway. It made her smile as well. Be a man. Let me go. If he doesn't measure up, I'll be back next week and we can talk, she said, attempting to cheer Daniel up. If you leave, everything will change. There's no going back to where we were, Daniel replied, wiping the final tear from his eye. She grabbed her luggage and headed out the door. I'll be right there, Chris said. I just have something to say to this little wimp. As Emily went to the vehicle, Chris approached Daniel. Chris's enormous arm launched his fist into the back of Daniel's head. The pounding was brief but unremarkable, as the first blow slammed Daniel's face into the baseboard. He was unconscious from the beginning. He didn't feel Chris kicking his stomach or pummeling him with his hands. He did not feel his spleen explode or his bones fracture. Chris wanted Daniel to remember extreme anguish when he awoke. He left without locking the door, got into the vehicle with Emily and drove north to the lake. Emily smiled throughout the journey. She recalls meeting Chris last winter. Daniel has always maintained his trim and athletic physique with jogging, boxing, and a high degree of physical activity at work. She, on the other hand, had plumped up somewhat and, although not overweight, seemed to be closer to 35 than her spouse of the same age. She joined Chris' gym and hired him as her trainer. She could still recall how he had first made love to her in the hot tub when they were the only two there. She was so enthralled by the attention that she let Chris to take her upstairs to his apartment, where they drilled frantically all night. She had never had an encounter like this with Daniel. Chris used his tool more vigorously than Daniel did, despite the fact that it was smaller. He was a beast in bed. Daniel had been gone for a week to oversee a traveling troupe of his most recent play in Atlanta. He even contacted her and said how much he missed her that first night, while Chris was sliding in and out of her. Chris entered, pouring his sperm into her just as Daniel hung up with a soft, "I love you." Emily's body spasmed as she mumbled, "I love you too," but she was actually aiming her words at Chris rather than Daniel. She treated Chris in every manner possible that week, until Daniel got home on Sunday, too exhausted from travel to make love. This was a nice thing. Emily awoke from a fantasy, concerned. She was concerned about Daniel's health since she still loved him. She was also concerned by Detective Thompson's foreboding note, which asked her to contact him about Daniel's beating. He wasn't phoning to tell her about the assault, it seemed like something she should already be aware of. She noticed Chris, a huge figure, concluding his exercise with chin-ups on a low-hanging limb. "Chris, what did you mean when you said it was taken care of?" she wondered, disheartened. Chris glanced up. "What do you mean?" "Last Thursday at my house, when we left and you came out of the house after me, you said, 'It's taken care of.'" "What did you mean by that?" "Ah, you know, just marking my new turf. I had to let him know who rules the roost. There's only one top dog in any pack, baby, and I'm going to make sure I'm yours," Chris said. "What did you do?" she inquired. "I punched him in the nose, roughed him up a little. It was really no big deal. Chris, the police left a message on my machine." "How was he badly hurt?" "Not by me, baby," he said. "He was awake and moaning when I left. Maybe he got hurt after getting drunk or had a burglar beat him after we left. We have to go back." "No way," he said. "We have 2 more days of sunning and drinking and 2 more nights of drilling to do. This is serious. He was badly injured and the police will be suspicious that I wasn't there and wasn't in contact. It's not going to look good if you hit him and he turns up beaten and we don't come back. You want to trade 2 nights of fun for 2 years in jail?" she screamed, raising her voice. Chris groaned and unwillingly accepted. "Okay, you may have a point," he responded. "Let's go then." They threw their belongings in the back, closed the cabin, and sped south. Daniel awoke in the hospital. As he entered the recovery area, his eyesight wavered due to the intense fluorescent lighting. He felt disoriented and had difficulty focusing. Only one eye was functional and he attempted to stand but was held. He instantly started to fight against his bindings. "Easy, easy," a nurse said. "Daniel, you've been in rough shape, but we'll get you through it. Don't fight us. We are on your side." He rested on the bed and looked at the nurse who was speaking to him. "Dr. Taylor will be right here and explain everything." "What's wrong with my eye?" Daniel said, worried when he saw his eye was severely bandaged. "It was badly hurt, but you have to wait and let the doctor talk to you. Stay calm. He'll be right here." Indeed, the doctor came soon. He examined Daniel and discussed his injuries. Daniel had been battered and his eye was bandaged after receiving at least one major hit. An optical surgeon fixed the detached retina, but fractures in his skull surrounding the eye socket needed to be treated as well. He had sustained a serious concussion as a consequence of the impact that produced these injuries, and they were relieved to learn that he still retained control of his voice. Daniel's arm was badly damaged and in a cast. He had almost died from a ruptured spleen and internal hemorrhaging. If his neighbor had found him an hour later, he would not have lived. His nose was fractured, as were many of his ribs. He had been asleep for 2 days when he was found, and doctors were still attempting to figure out when his attack occurred so they could estimate how long he had been laying neglected. "I don't remember an attack," Daniel said, perplexed. The doctor scowled and started asking questions regarding Daniel's memories. When he learned Daniel couldn't recall anything from the weekend or the previous Thursday, he started asking generic questions. When he concluded, Dr. Taylor realized Daniel had forgotten everything that had transpired since his freshman year before meeting Emily. Daniel's assault had resulted in serious memory loss, and only time would tell when it would return. Detective Thompson, who had been assigned to investigate Daniel's case, was obviously troubled. His sequence of events leading up to the assault had come to a dead end. Daniel disabled the house security system last Thursday. Or did he disable it? Daniel and Emily had met in college. They were both engaged in performing arts programs in Boston, which is home to one of the world's most active theatrical communities. She was training to be an actor, learning how to create the illusion of a tale on stage. She was amazing, but had problems accepting instruction and liked to provide it. Her professors saw this and started preparing her for a future as a director or in theater administration. Daniel was interested in the backstage magic of the theater. He didn't have to manufacture illusions like an actor. Instead, he used music, lighting, effects, and set designs to create other realms. He made the actors' work simple to believe. Daniel was quickly identified as intelligent. He was one of those rare artists who grasped every facet of technical theater, from lighting design to sound storyline. They met when they were both recruited to work on a summer project in Vermont following their junior year. Emily was called in as stage manager for a mentor and professor who had just been appointed as director of 2 of the company's summer performances. Daniel had worked there as a house electrician the previous 2 summers. However, this year he was appointed assistant lighting director and was given the chance to create one of the performances. Working closely together, the 2 were immediately drawn to one another. These would be the first of many collaborative projects, first as students and subsequently as professionals in the area. Emily was a slim, willowy figure with a deadly grin under her dark brown eyes. She was beautifully curvaceous in the right places yet had no additional weight. Her long tanned legs protruded from the shorts she usually wore, and her shirts were modest enough to suggest, "Please behave," while yet showing enough to imply, "I may have a surprise for you." Daniel was dashingly gorgeous. He was an ardent runner and amateur boxer who said his finest ideas came during his early runs. Once his mind was free of the hodgepodge of daily distractions, he seemed to work out on a regular basis but didn't have to. The day-to-day lifting and climbing he had to perform was an excellent substitute for the weight training his buddies recommended. He was healthy and trim, and he was quite certain that if he continued to work on achieving his schemes, even if he was the designer, he would remain so throughout his life. Their senior year was a haze. Daniel saw Emily on a regular basis and their relationship became stronger with each passing day. By the end of the year, both of their professions had established themselves, with Daniel working regularly as a designer at many modest suburban homes and often backstage at prominent designers' city theaters. Emily obtained a position backstage at one of the main opera companies based at the Kennedy Center, a stable employment with excellent benefits that she could retain for the rest of her life. They shared a modest apartment just across the street from her theater and loved the city's thriving performing arts scene. Daniel recalled the lovely times they had shared. She was a sophisticated designer and a skilled shopper, and she had decorated their flat in such a fashionable style that it had become a favorite hangout for their friends. He was a gourmet chef, and whether he was preparing for themselves and guests or just the two of them, he always had her eyes rolling with joy at his delectable creations. Daniel recalls his wedding in great detail. The event in the modest church was vividly remembered. He could hear the little organ playing Bach and smell the unique perfume of the beeswax candles burning at the altar, and his eyes welled up at the sight of his wife heading toward him, smiling. He could taste the exquisite food at the little Greek restaurant where they had their wedding reception. They had danced and embraced their relatives and friends before departing for the little inn where they would spend their wedding night. It was wonderful. The fire on a brick fireplace just beyond their bed's foot lighted up the room. They stood next to the flickering flames and kissed. Dr. Taylor then stopped by for his evening rounds. He was relieved to see Daniel recalling events up to his wedding, but there was still a 12-year gap. He promised to offer Daniel some information as long as he accepted it quietly. "You're still married to Emily. According to the neighbor who found you and saved your life, you're still working as a freelance theater designer and doing quite well. You want a fine home, very near this hospital. You and your wife have had no children, but otherwise, you're the stereotypical happy couple living the American dream," the doctor explained. He went on to describe the severity of Daniel's injuries again, now that he was more aware and conscious. They were quite certain that he would totally recover from everything. He went into detailed medical explanations of each damage, but Daniel just heard blah blah blah. Daniel's bandages were removed from his eye Thursday morning. His body clock was finally recovering from the effects of his trauma and surgical anesthetic. He remained attentive and flirted with his nurses. Repeated interviews with police had given no results, which infuriated Detective Mark Williams. Daniel was relieved to recall his comfortable home life with Emily, as well as his work on shows that continued until roughly a year ago. He also remembers a major project with his studio. There was something about his recording equipment and sound effects. It nagged him, but he couldn't figure out what it meant. He also recalled an extreme agony that seemed connected to the sensations in his brain, but he couldn't figure out how. He slept well Thursday night, knowing he'd be able to return home Friday. Emily returned home to find a dark house when Daniel was falling asleep. Chris brought her luggage in for her, and they were both surprised to find the sign pinned to the door, saying that the area had been a crime scene but that processing had been completed and that tenants might return inside. Emily paused in front of a big puddle of dried blood on the hallway floor, where Daniel had lain. She stared at Chris. "Just a punch to the nose, hurt?" she inquired. Chris blanched with wrath. "He may have gone a little overboard, and if I left Daniel in a critical state without aid, I could be charged with something more than simple assault. He was trying to figure out why. It wasn't my mind that I honed into a precision machine," Chris murmured. "We can't inform the police. I slapped him. We must tell them I went first, bringing your suitcase to the vehicle, and that he was well when you departed." "This is bad, Chris." "This is very bad," Emily said. "Emily, stick to the story. We'll be okay. We'll look like heels for leaving and not being there for him, but they can't pin anything on us." "Us?" Emily was astonished. "I was in the car. Anything that gets pinned on anything will be on your sorry hide, not mine. Separating from Daniel, even divorcing him, is one thing. Going to jail for beating him is another." "You were with me, baby," Chris said. "And you heard me say he was defeated. You were in this with me. I may not be the smartest guy on the block, but I know what an accomplice is." Emily thought about it and knew Chris was correct. She wouldn't be able to explain their rapid departure unless they said they left Daniel in excellent condition, leaving open the potential that someone else had come in and thrashed him. How did she end herself in this mess? She agreed with Chris and they clarified their tale. It was after late when they finally settled what to say. She phoned Detective Thompson, who informed them he'd see them at the police station right away. This was an essential subject that could not wait until the morning. Emily wanted to go to the hospital first, but Detective Thompson insisted. He informed her that Daniel was medically stable and would most likely be sleeping. He pointed out that she hadn't been in a rush to visit Daniel while he was in critical condition, and she had even gone home tonight rather going straight to the hospital. There was no need to disrupt his slumber, which was very important for his rehabilitation. There were questions that needed to be addressed. Emily didn't say anything until the detective offered to have a patrolman pick her up and drive her. She and Chris got in their vehicle and drove to the station. They were questioned individually, although both had prepared their stories. They didn't say much, relying on a lot of "I don't know." However, they did reveal they had gone to the home and saw Daniel. They confessed he was obviously upset when they departed, but he was physically uninjured. Detective Thompson did not believe them, but he had no proof to back up his suspicions. He was informed that Daniel was being discharged from the hospital today, so he planned to keep the two in lockup until Daniel had a chance to settle in and Thompson could inform him that his wife was returning home. It may also offer Chris and Emily a chance to assume the other had folded over and admitted the truth, allowing them to communicate more openly. When Daniel's neighbor, John, arrived home, Detective Thompson was waiting for him. Daniel cautiously exited the automobile, still pained from his vicious assault, and waved Thompson inside the home. Linda, John's wife, had been over earlier to tidy up the hallway. The home was lovely and welcoming, and something smelled fantastic. She smiled as she walked out of the kitchen, inviting everyone to the table for a homemade welcome home supper. Though Daniel appreciated Linda's efforts, particularly in cleaning up the aftermath of the tragedy, he remained unhappy at home. He could now recall events from 2 weeks previously, right up to the day of the tragedy. He was irritated because he didn't have those remaining parts. Linda and John finished cleaning up the kitchen and said their goodbyes. They had worked out a plan with some of the other neighbors to check in every hour or two to make sure Daniel was all right, at least for the weekend. They made assured that he understood that if he needed anything, he should call immediately. As they walked away, Detective Thompson turned at Daniel and remarked, "She'll be home soon, you know." "I know," Daniel said, staring at Emily's suitcase near the entrance. "I'll hold them today, just to make sure you're squared away and ready to meet her." "All right," Detective Thompson answered, observing Daniel's resolution in his voice and gaze. "I want to show you something," Daniel said. He escorted Thompson inside his studio, where the investigator was fascinated by the variety of acoustic equipment, digital image equipment, and computer systems on display. Daniel moved up to a computer workstation linked to a massive mixing board. "This is my main audio recording rig. I have all kinds of interesting files on here, some of which I forgot until just a minute ago. For the last day or two, a memory has been nagging at me. There was something about a project I was working on but couldn't remember when. John and Linda left, and it reminded me of another couple leaving the house, the couple that left the house last Thursday, just before I was attacked." He waited for a time, inspecting the recording equipment. "It's possible I was recording something when they came to call and neglected to turn the recorder off. It's possible there's an audio file on here that would explain things to you in case something happens to me. It's possible I recorded everything from the time Emily and Chris left here until the recording reached my preset limit, which was set to 12 hours. Detective Thompson scowled. "Daniel, I wish you wouldn't," he said. "I'd be happy if you let me fight my own battles," Daniel said calmly but firmly. "I have everything I need to handle this on my own. You don't need to get involved." Detective Thompson paid close attention to Daniel. "I'm not suspicious, Daniel. I don't have to be, because I know your intent is to return the thrashing and humiliation Chris generously lavished on you 2 weeks ago." He took a breath and said, "I love to watch a good bare-knuckle fight. Unfortunately, I'd have to arrest both participants and witnesses. But I also love to see an underdog come back strong and take back what he lost. Chris is a big guy and works out hard at the gym. But it won't matter." Daniel grinned faintly. "Hey, what I don't know won't hurt me. Just give yourself time to heal a bit longer." Detective Thompson grinned back. "I'll give you that. Get yourself back in shape, Daniel." Thompson departed, wishing Daniel the best and ensuring that his phone number was put on his mobile phone's fast dial. A few days later, Chris returned Emily home from the county jail. Her hair was tangled and her clothes were unkempt. They both entered the home, but Chris stayed at the entrance as Emily walked into the living room alone. Emily said, "Hi," hesitantly. Daniel only gazed at her, expressionless. "I heard you were hurt, so I came home early," she said. Inside, Daniel was bursting. In the worst possible manner, he wanted to leap out of the chair and chastise her for her little concern, coming home 2 days early from a vacation she shouldn't have gone to have an affair. He didn't understand and couldn't condone it, but he exuded calm indifference. "That's right," he said, his tone chilly. Emily was astonished by his lack of emotion. She had anticipated more. "Are you okay now?" she inquired. "We need to talk." "We don't need to talk," Daniel said coldly. "We talked 2 weeks ago. We can't just let this fester in our minds. You have to talk this through with me. I need to know what to expect." "Expect to separate, then divorce," Daniel said. "Expect to go away from me and never be welcomed back. Expect me to treat you with the respect any other human deserves, but without the love and care I felt for you a week ago." Emily anticipated some of this, but she didn't expect him to be so cool and composed. She would remain for a few days and then go after she had arranged her business. She placed down her purse and took a seat. "I said you're leaving," Daniel murmured, glancing at her. Emily turned to look at him, puzzled. "I'm leaving." "Now, go," Daniel replied, his tone harsh. "I don't think you understand what's going on here. I may have offended you and I may have ended our marriage, but I have given up no rights to my home or belongings. I'll move into the guest room, but I'm staying here until I get my things together and move out." Before she could proceed, Daniel clicked a remote in his palm. The whole house sound system he had built turned on and started playing back a tape of last Thursday's events. "You can clearly hear her sarcastically belittling me as she told me she was going on a vacation with a real man and I couldn't stop her," Daniel said with a firm tone. "You can hear Chris laughing as she told me she planned to sleep with him all week or even longer until she was satisfied. You can hear me trying to stop her one last time, her heels clicking noisily on the floor as she left with Chris, saying, 'Tough luck, little wimp.' After the door slammed shut, you can hear it open again, with Emily calling, 'Come on, Chris.' In the distance, Chris called back to her and then you can clearly hear him say to me, 'Just so there are an.' A horrible sound followed Daniel being beaten by Chris. You can hear Chris grunt as he kicked me repeatedly in the ribs and worse. You can hear him taunting me, telling me how he was going to beat the hell out of me today and then the hell out of Emily that night. On the way out, Chris left a parting blow. Now your head is as broken as your wimpy heart. You just lay there in your blood and think for an hour or two. You'll realize she needs the big dog to make her happy, but she'll come back to you when she realizes the big." Daniel's expression hardened as he gazed at Emily. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she listened to the tape. Chris stepped around the doorframe, scowling at Daniel. "Why, you little conniving pansy." Daniel stopped him by lifting his finger. "Porter doesn't have the recording, but he'll get it if I want him to. There's a video that was shot by the camera right over your head. If the audio doesn't work, the video will surely land you in jail for attempted murder. I don't want him to put you in jail, Chris. I want a rematch." Emily was shocked. Chris beamed ear to ear. "I propose a wager. You both have to accept, and your terms are different, or there is no deal, and Porter gets the sound file in 10 minutes via email." Daniel took a big breath. 6 weeks, a month from today, once this cast is off my arm and my ribs have healed. You can't win. Steve shakes his head. No, I couldn't win. After that cheap shot 2 weeks ago, this time we fight fair and square. No sneaking up from behind to cold cock an unsuspecting victim, you coward. You're going to see me coming, and you won't be able to stop me any more than I could stop you lying there unconscious 2 weeks ago. Are you sure you can win under those terms? Fair fight, mano a mano, no weapons. I'll rip you up. Daniel glared at Chris with iron determination. You bet your Jim on it. Chris gazed at him again, preparing to sacrifice everything. He had complete ownership of both the gym and the building in which it was located. The skyscraper housed multiple rich tenants and was a huge moneymaker. His flat occupied the top story of the building, a beautiful area with views of Chesapeake Bay. However, Chris did not believe Daniel could compete with a fit lifter like him. Sure, David beat Goliath, but David had a sling, Daniel replied with a sardonic grin. Chris hesitated, considering the risks. He had multiple vintage and late-model Mustangs, one from each decade dating back to the 1950s. They were his pride and pleasure, and the whole community knew it. It raised the stakes dramatically, but Chris believed Daniel was nothing. Nothing. He grinned and responded, fine. You hold all the cards, don't you? I'll risk it all. But there's really no risk. I'll thrash you. Daniel gazed at Emily. She had listened to him describe the stakes to Chris and was now bracing herself to hear about her own danger. If I win, Daniel commented, I want it all. I want you gone. No contesting the divorce, no taking anything from this house or our cottage, and not a dime from our bank account or investments. You have to watch every minute of the fight. You also have to live with Chris until the fight, and if I win, he can still have you. You are useless to me. Emily shook, but nodded in accord. She knew Chris was powerful, but she also knew Daniel was in good condition, ran a lot, and had boxing experience. She had seen him manhandle spools of cable and pipe backstage, which usually required two people to move. Daniel gazed at her with the same blank face, and it made her nervous not to be able to read him. What if I'd rather bet on you, she said gently. You already made that choice 2 weeks ago, Daniel said. This week, your choice is freedom or jail. I made my choice the day you walked out the door. The weeks went fast and Daniel spent them regaining strength. He'd started taking on lighting jobs again. His departure from the scene had left a void, and his return was warmly anticipated. He was repeatedly probed about his assault, but he refused to provide information. The circumstances surrounding his marriage sparked a flood of speculations. It was well known that she was now living with Chris. Some suspected the truth and awaited Daniel's response. He was renowned for his tenacity, and none of these people expected him to go through the humiliation of being beaten and having his wife taken away without responding. The tales that Emily had abandoned Daniel in his worst hour, coupled with the fact that he was so popular, had made her a pariah in the theatrical world. The night of the battle came. Daniel stepped into the gym wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. Chris was already at the ring, dressed in ridiculous-looking boxer shorts and a muscle shirt with his gym's emblem. Emily sat sullenly at a table, clutching an envelope containing Chris' titles and contracts, his stakes in the bet. Chris was surrounded by his friends, gym workers, and customers. They were all encouraging him, clapping and taunting him about the light task he was going to do. They teased much more when Daniel entered the room. Daniel's lean runner's frame seemed to be no match for Chris's bulging, muscular torso. Daniel strolled right by Emily, dropping his folio with his contracts and the video on the table next to Chris as he got into the ring. Let's go, Daniel said. No bells, no refs, no stopping until one of us is beaten. Chris smiled as he lumbered to the ropes and climbed in. He extended his hand to Daniel, but Daniel declined and jabbed Chris in the nose instead. Chris glanced up, surprised, with a drop of blood dripping from his right nostril. No bells, Daniel muttered, striking Chris again. Chris's body was outstanding, but he lacked Daniel's flexibility. His tight body hindered his response time, and he moved more slowly than Daniel, who bobbled and weaved with ease. Chris lumbered after Daniel, but his large physique couldn't respond quickly enough to catch the agile Daniel. Every time Chris came near enough to strike his opponent, Daniel punished him with a barrage of punches to the face. Chris's face quickly swelled, and he reduced his efforts to bulldoze Daniel into a corner. Chris quickly understood that at the middle of the ring, he was no better off. Daniel didn't seem to be very tall, yet he was a small guy with a significant edge in reach. He wasn't slowing down, although Chris was exhausted after throwing so many haymakers, the finest of which just missed their target. As Chris got tired, Daniel started to connect with his body. It wasn't long until Chris's hands became heavy and fell. Daniel picked him apart. Daniel built up a massive margin 15 seconds later. Chris's forehead was a massive lump under his right eye. Give it up, Chris. You can barely stand. You can't defend. You've lost. Chris stared up at him, panting hard. Both eyes were enlarged and blood was seeping from his nose. There was also a severe cut under the one eye that could still see. Give it up now, and I'll leave you with more than you deserve. Apologize in front of everyone here, do it now, and I'll just take this gym, this building, and the 58 convertible. You keep the rest. If you don't give up now, I'll knock you out and keep it all. Chris realized he had been defeated. His head was already down as his body sank to its knees. I apologize, he murmured faintly. Daniel walked to the table and pulled out the deeds to the building, the gym, and the title to the 1958 Mustang. He gazed at the stunned group of Chris' friends and acquaintances. I'm closing the gym and opening a theater school here. I'll honor your employment contracts with Chris, but I'll expect you to work for me in a useful capacity. If he transfers you to one of his other gyms, I'll release you from contractual obligations here. For those of you who are tenants in the building, I'll honor your leases and treat you fairly in negotiations when they expire. However, there will be a different atmosphere here, as this room will be renovated. Emily gave Daniel a skeptical look. They had long dreamed of forming a community of theater professionals and amateurs devoted to advancing the field of theatrical arts. He was not only constructing their goal without her, but he had the means to do it because of her treachery. She felt completely excluded and became quite lonely and chilly. Her face lost its color. She glanced at a battered Chris, whose face was already dark with bruises and crimson with blood from the wounds his companions had just bandaged. Chris had never looked so pathetic and shattered. Daniel had never seemed so confident. There was no boasting or arrogance, just a quiet assurance with which he accomplished everything. 6 months later, Emily was still living with Chris. Since the quarrel, neither had developed sexual feelings for the other. Nonetheless, they had to live together. It was a frosty cohabitation, as each assumed the other was to blame for their misfortune. Chris never challenged Daniel's agreement and kept his end of the bargain. Daniel did give Chris some money to make it seem like a commercial transaction, but it was just 1% of the entire value of the land. Emily had swiftly and silently left her house, which was now totally Daniel's. The divorce had been settled years ago. Daniel had not spoken to her since the argument, and he had not returned her calls the few times she attempted to reach him. Chris worked hard to expand his firm, but it had halted. Word of his failure in the ring spread, and he was preserving what he had by promoting membership packages geared at the elderly and mothers who did not work outside the house. 2 of his satellite gyms had shuttered, and the others had lost much of their allure. He had lost his penthouse apartment when he lost his building to Daniel, and he had to relocate to a small condo near one of his surviving gyms, which acted as his flagship. His swagger was no longer as strong, and it was often absent. Instead of the confidence he radiated before the whole event with Daniel, he seemed much less menacing. His attitude was typically morose, and he was always concerned about money since he no longer had rentals from his downtown building to fund his other endeavors. Daniel had successfully transformed the big gym into a magnificent theater venue. He had turned smaller sections into practice spaces, stores, and dressing rooms. He created an intimate tiny cabaret theater on the ground level and built a coffee shop with a little stage. A summer season was already planned, and the community was humming with enthusiasm about the opportunities Daniel was offering to players and viewers of all ages. Daniel had been so preoccupied with establishing up business, as was his plan, that it nearly seemed that he had forgotten the whole incident, which occurred less than a year ago. He still recalled clearly. He recalled every night as he stepped through his front door. He recalled every night as he fell asleep in his lonely chamber. He recalled every time he visited a theater where he and Emily had worked together on a project. As much as he tried, he couldn't get away from the memories of sharing a half-life and yet not knowing the lady he considered the love of his life. One night, he was working on a light storyline at his studio when the doorbell rang. It was Emily's brother, Andrew. Andrew resided in Boston and seldom left the city. In truth, he had only visited Emily twice throughout her time with Daniel. His appearance indicated that something was amiss. "Hi, Daniel," Andrew remarked as he went in. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I really need to talk to you about my sister. Would you mind if I came in?" Daniel moved aside and led Andrew into the living room, sensing the desperation in his words. He offered Andrew a cup of coffee or beer, but he rejected. "I'd really like to get right to the reason I came to see you," Andy stated. "I'm really sorry things worked out so badly between you two. I thought you were a great couple and want you to know our entire family was shocked by my sister's sudden change of heart. She's committed to keeping her part of the bargain. She knows she was foolish to give you up for a fling, but her life with Chris just isn't right. She chose Chris over me. Daniel grumbled. It just seemed appropriate that she get exactly what she wanted. She chose a fling. She was wrong and betrayed you miserably, and nobody blames you for how you responded. She was foolish, but living with Chris is torture. And now he's made it physical. He hit her and broke her nose last night. Daniel was not thrilled to learn Emily was being assaulted. He wanted her to have to put up with Chris's ignorance, his early American jock decor, and the lifestyle of a full-time gym rat. He wanted her to feel outraged by Chris's misogynistic remarks and demands, his selfish attitudes, and his limitless pride. However, Daniel decided to assist. Andrew and Daniel drove to Chris' home. Daniel drove up behind Andrew's vehicle, and the two of them strolled straight inside Chris's home, as if they owned it. Chris didn't like the move but wasn't in a position to disagree. He'd struck Emily, and now Daniel and Andrew were here. One of them had publicly whipped him. Either of them might now put him to prison for abuse, and Andrew was utilizing that angle like a slave driver. Chris was transferring Emily's belongings to the vehicle. Andrew had helped him pack, but Chris was doing the lugging. There wasn't much, since her divorce deal had only left her with a few souvenirs and her wardrobe. Chris returned inside after his final expedition. He started speaking, but Daniel stopped him off. "Don't say a word." Chris stared at Daniel, who seemed enraged. "You know what has to happen now, right?" Chris did not want to hear it. "You broke her nose. You hit a little woman and messed up her face by breaking her nose. Stand up, Chris." Chris gazed at him but remained submissive. Emily also stood. She moved closer to Chris, and before Chris or Andrew could foresee what would happen, Emily smashed Chris's nose with a quick right. Emily's expression of forgiveness for Daniel was seen as a signal by his neighbors, family, and the theatrical community. She was welcomed back into those circles with virtually the same grandeur she had enjoyed all those months before, despite the fact that no one had forgotten where she was. Chris sold his enterprises and, after some thought, realized he didn't enjoy being a jerk. He eventually put his college PE degree to action by working at a local elementary school. He acquired a soft place for dealing with children who have physical disabilities and other special needs. He became a Special Olympics coach and volunteered in the physical therapy department of a nearby children's hospital. Daniel's theatrical project came, and his classes were certified by a nearby institution. His initiatives for school children were well regarded and lucrative. His professional shows sold out and drew the attention of renowned Boston reviewers who seldom ventured beyond Broadway. Daniel and Emily lived near to one another but seldom communicated. She had been his life's love, and he couldn't bear the thought of her being completely destroyed, abused and ostracized by the group that ruled the profession she loved for. After he had set her up, he wanted nothing else from her. He dealt with her professionally. After all, she was competent at her job and a valuable addition to his firm. He couldn't view her in any other way, and he seldom talked to her as a friend. Emily saw her role in Daniel's life as a gift. She wasn't in prison, she was working, and she was able to make apologies to Daniel in some little manner. She believed that staying close to him, even if he never loved her again, was preferable to the alternative. There was no way she could make things up to him, but if she remained here until she saw him happily settled with a new love and maybe a family, she might be able to find peace. It was inevitable. Daniel fell in love with a divorced lady he met by the lake. She spent the summer in a nearby cottage with her brother's family and her little daughter. She moved in with Daniel that autumn, and they married in October in a lovely but intimate wedding in Daniel's garden. Emily had denied the offer to attend, but she had seen the event from her bedroom window, which was the only one with a view. She shed bitter tears as she recalled the events that had led her to this point, and now the last chapter was complete. Her tears dropped on her final little suitcase. When the group arrived at Daniel's home for dinner, she had already placed the remaining items into the rental vehicle parked outside the garage. Emily grabbed her purse and climbed into her vehicle. She took one more glance at Daniel's home before driving away. She was certain he would discover the farewell note she had placed on his desk when he returned from his honeymoon. She checked her carry-on one last time to ensure that she had her ticket, passport, and signed contract for her new job as a stage manager in London. Daniel had a new life now. She shed one more tear before leaving to locate hers. Thank you for watching. Do you believe Daniel made the correct decision? Let us know in the comments and remember to like and subscribe.